friend, the Prime Minister, confirmed that we would provide £3 billion a year in military aid this year, next year, and every year that it's needed. This includes, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary's announcements today, with more funding for Ukraine's Navy, more funding for drones, the extension of Op Interflex, which has trained more than 50,000 Ukrainian troops to date, and I have also increased non-military support. This financial year, we will give at least £250 million in bilateral assistance for work such as on protecting the Ukrainian power grid. We've just this weekend suffered another Russian onslaught. Mr. Speaker, crucially, our bilateral support, both militarily and non-military, will be higher this financial year than in any previous financial year since the war began. And Mr. Speaker, let me also pay tribute to the opposition for their leadership on these issues when they were in office, because the truth is this House has been able to speak on Ukraine with one voice, and long may that continue. But that is not all that we've done. We've also finding creative ways to bolster the Ukrainian economy further. We've brought the UK-Ukraine digital trade deal into force so that they benefit from cheaper and quicker trade. UK Export Finance has provided over £500 million in loan guarantees, including for Ukraine's own defence industry. British International Investment is working with the Ukrainian Bank of Reconstruction and Development to support Ukrainian trade. By the end of this year, we will have deployed a further $484 million in World Bank loan guarantees. And tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, this House will debate a bill confirming a new £2.26 billion loan to Ukraine as part of a G7 package of $50 billion. This extraordinary revenue acceleration scheme will sustain Ukraine in the fight, all paid for by the profits from frozen Russian assets. Mr. Speaker, I've made it my personal mission to do all that I can to constrain the Kremlin. Since July, we've sanctioned almost 40 vessels in Putin's shadow fleet of oil tankers, barring them from our ports and denying them access to our maritime services. We've sanctioned firms who supply Russia's military-industrial complex, including Chinese firms sending critical components such as for drones. We've sanctioned cyber criminals from the aptly named Evil Corps, Russian troops who've used chemical weapons on the battlefield, mercenaries responsible for destabilising Africa, and we've taken further action this week. Yesterday, I imposed more sanctions in response to Iran's transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia, including on Iran Air. And today, I'm announcing measures against those monsters who have forcibly deported Ukrainian children for attempted indoctrination by the Kremlin. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of all this government has done to support Ukraine, proud of the unity that this House has shown on this issue, proud that we have proven Britain will remain Ukraine's staunchest friend throughout this war and in the peace that follows. But we are always stronger when we work with others. So I'm also proud of what we've done to rally international support to Ukraine. I visited Ukraine with US Secretary of State Tony Blinken, the first such joint visit to any country for over a decade. I discussed Ukraine with the EU Foreign Affairs Council, the first appearance by a Foreign Secretary at a regular Council meeting since our EU exit. And yesterday, I chaired a meeting of the United Nations Security Council on Ukraine. And just this morning, I joined a meeting of close European allies to discuss how we bolster our support for Ukraine over the coming months. In all our discussions with allies and partners across the globe, we are stressing three fundamental truths about this war. First, Ukraine's cause is a just one. It is Putin who chose to invade a sovereign country which posed no threat to Russia. Putin who disregarded the UN Charter. Putin who's trying to turn back the clock to an age of empire building when might made right and ordinary people must suffer the consequences. And it's Putin and his allies who are recklessly escalating this war with Iranian ballistic missiles used to strike Ukrainian cities and North Korean troops sent to attack Ukrainian soldiers. So when we support Ukraine, we're not just aiding the fight for their freedom, we're also contributing to our fight for our freedom, the freedom of all states, all over the world, to choose their own destiny and future. The second truth, Putin's war is not in fact going that well. Russia is almost 1,000 days into a war it thought it would end in days, and we should never forget that. Russia has suffered record numbers of casualties in the past 2 months, with numbers killed or injured due to exceed 1 million next year. Russia is slashing welfare payments and raising interest rates to levels not seen in decades, all to fund more arms. And Russia has had to turn to Tehran. It's had to turn to Pyongyang as reserves of Soviet-era equipment and targets for Kremlin press gangs run low. This is not sustainable. The war is costing Putin dearly, all in a fight for land to which Russia has absolutely no right, and for which the Russian people are paying an enormous price. And the final truth, Mr. Speaker, Putin has no interest in a just peace. It is 1,000 days since his full-scale invasion, but over 10 years since he first seized Crimea and sponsored insurrection in the Donbass, and even longer that he has sought to meddle in Ukrainian affairs, all to further his own interests. Putin has a track record of violating past agreements. He shows no sign of wanting peace. He would seek to exploit any pause in fighting to win his troops a respite before resuming hostilities, as he did after the failed Minsk talks. Mr. Speaker, we underlie these truths because they must inform our strategy. If we want to see peace restored in Europe, we need Putin to see there's no route to military victory. We need to make the price he pays for his senseless war even higher. We need to remember the price we would pay for his victory would be higher still. We need Ukraine to stay strong, and so they need us to stay strong by their side. That is what this House wants us to do. That is what this government will do. That is what we call on our allies to do. Slava Ukraini. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement, and importantly to the government for making time to acknowledge and mark this absolutely tragic and terrible anniversary. I, like so many in this House, remember the early morning of that dark day in February in 2022, 1,000 days ago. As Home Secretary at the time, I recall that early morning call, being notified of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. It was a day we had all feared, having seen Russian troops gather close to the border in several weeks beforehand, and over the previous decade since the invasion of Crimea and Russian support for the separatists in Donbass. The sovereign territory of a European nation had been violated, and as the Foreign Secretary has said, we've all watched the horrors unfold over the last 1,000 days, but we saw them very specifically in those early days as the Russian military machine advanced deeper into Ukrainian territory. I pay tribute to the heroism, the courage, and the bravery of Ukrainian armed forces, and also to the people who have proudly defended their sovereign territory. Let us be in no doubt, Putin expected Ukraine to capitulate and for their government to fall. He thought that he could be an aggressive bully and bully his way into that territory. But the bravery of President Zelensky, and with that bravery they all stood tall. They fought on, and they are fighting every day, and at the cost of Russia, and to Russia, it has been catastrophic. They're not just fighting for their country, they're fighting, Mr. Speaker, for their freedoms and our shared values of freedom, democracy, sovereignty and fundamental rights. And throughout that time, and before Russian troops crossed the border, I think we should be proud that this Parliament has stood shoulder to shoulder with our Ukrainian friends. And Mr. Speaker, you will also recall that in 2022, the entire government machinery mobilised to support Ukraine, and that cross-party support has to this day been pivotal. Right from the start of creating safer routes that enabled 20,000 plus Ukrainians to come to our country, from the work of the Ministry of Defence under Ben Wallace at the time, to being one of the first countries to provide and supply weapons and key capabilities to train Ukrainian troops in our own country, and to sign that security cooperation agreement that the Foreign Secretary Secretary has mentioned, to announce the multi-million and multi-billion funding package as well. And the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, flew the flag for Ukraine across the world, making that case, and also imposing sanctions on Russia, persuading others of their commitment to Ukraine and fighting that cause for freedom. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the government in every single effort, and the commitments have been solid, along with working with all our partners in that absolutely unstinting way. And Mr. Speaker, I also saw that devastation when I met Ukrainians on the Polish border fleeing the conflict. And I know so many members of this House have visited Ukraine and met families over the last 1,000 days. We've all been touched by those personal horror stories, the loss, the grief from people and children whose lives have been shattered, and our thoughts are with them. It's a sobering and stark reminder that while the modern world has delivered so much progress for humankind, and there are unreconstructed tyrants that are inflicting misery beyond comprehension with their contempt for human dignity, democracy and the rule of law. And we saw that so clearly over the weekend with those devastating waves of attacks that were unleashed by Putin. I do have a few questions for the Foreign Secretary off the back of his statement. On military support, will the Secretary of State confirm that we will continue to provide all the resources we can from our own stocks and work with our allies in NATO to ensure equivalent equipment is available for Ukraine if we do not progress with specific capabilities ourselves? NATO countries, as we know, are able to leverage a collective GDP 20 times greater than Russia and a combined defence inventory many times larger than the Kremlin's. So there is nothing inevitable about Russia's victory in this war, and I know the Defence Secretary is on the front bench today as well, and he'll have views on that, but I think we'd welcome some indication as to what steps the government will take to replenish our stocks. And does the Foreign Secretary, on behalf of the government, agrees that this shows why it's important that we have a clear pathway to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030? And beyond the provision of lethal aid and capability, can the Foreign Secretary give updates on his diplomatic activity and actions to further isolate Russia and address this influx of troops from North Korea? Exactly. On sanctions, we absolutely welcomed the announcements this week on those sanctions on Iran for supporting the Russian war effort, and we must pursue those with vigour. Also, with this, can we seek assurances that the government will continue to review the measures when it comes to people and entities within the scope of sanctions so that we can absolutely do more to prosecute Russia's role in this conflict? And can the Foreign Secretary outline the approach that will be taken to engaging with the new US administration more widely with our allies to back Ukraine? It's vital that this House stands united, Mr. Speaker, and as we mark the 1,000 days of this war, we must ensure we continue to stand shoulder to shoulder on the side of freedom. Slava Ukraini.
Yeah. Foreign Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is my first opportunity to congratulate the Right Honourable Lady on taking up her post. We probably will disagree occasionally on a few things across the dispatch box, but I hope that we will never disagree on the support that we have to give to Ukraine, and her statement this afternoon underlies, I think, the unity of this House. And she's right to recall the mobilisation of the last government back in 2022. I'm glad she reminded the House of the way that British people have been prepared to open their homes in record numbers to so many Ukrainians, and for her leadership of the department during that time. And she's also right to raise our military-industrial capacity. And can I assure her that in coming into office, my right honourable friend has made it his business to get underneath the bonnet of how we can procure, how we contract, how we ensure innovation. Of course, British support is also driving immense innovation in Ukraine, which both I and the Defence Secretary have been able to see close up. It's something like a blitz spirit, which is quite incredible. It's a whole nation effort, and working in partnership, that can also drive innovation in our own system. She raises, quite rightly, defence spending. She will know that there are still countries in Europe, and indeed beyond Europe, who are not spending the 2% that is necessary, and we urge them to do that. And successive US presidents, long before Donald Trump, have been raising that as an issue. And of course, it is our intention to get back to 2.5% of GDP. That's what it was when we left office, and we want to get back there. And I just remind her that in terms of military support, £7.8 billion this country is now committed to military support, and the Prime Minister has committed to provide £3 billion a year in military support for as long as it takes. She's right to raise the huge concerns about the DPRK. 10,000 North Korean troops are in Russia as we speak. This is a major escalation, and I have to say it has been noted deeply too in the Republic of Korea, because it links the Indo-Pacific to the Euro-Atlantic, which is a subject that, as she knows, our system has been concerned about for many, many years indeed, but this is a major escalation in relation to that. She's right also to raise sanctions. The UK has now sanctioned over 2,100 individuals and entities under the Russian sanctions regime. As I set out, the Russian shadow fleet I have gone after particularly. There is more to come. We will bear down heavily over the coming months and work with partners both in the United States and Europe to achieve that. And she will have read about my dinner with the Prime Minister and Donald Trump. We did discuss Ukraine, and he was seized of the important issues. Donald Trump is a winner, not a loser, and I'm sure he wants to ensure that the West is on the winning side.
Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Mr Speaker, members of my committee and I have been meeting large numbers of Europeans, our friends and neighbours, not just Ukrainians, but also last week we met the Foreign Minister from Estonia, who told us that it was only a few hundred kilometres from his country where North Koreans were fighting on European soil. Yesterday we met Moldovan members of Parliament who pointed out that Russian rockets had been in their airspace the night before. But from everyone, what we're hearing is that there is mounting concern about changes of leadership in the United States, potentially with elections happening in Germany, that there might be a challenge to the united support that we in the West have had for Ukraine over the last 1,000 days. What strategy does my right honourable friend have to ensure that we remain strong, to make sure that we understand, that all of us understand, that you defeated Ukraine and an emboldened Putin is a defeat for all of us?
Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and obviously for her leadership on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee too. She is absolutely right. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine poses, yes, a serious risk to the UK and Euro-Atlantic prosperity and security, but it is a direct threat to the international rules-based system and international principles of sovereignty, Mr. Speaker, and territorial integrity. That is why I am quite sure that when you think about our joint intelligence capability with the United States, about our joint military capability with the United States, remembering that we've got many US troops stationed in our own country and tens of thousands stationed across Europe. In the end, with the developments that we've seen also with Korea, I'm quite sure that we will continue to stand with Ukraine.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for advance sight of these statements. So I join members on all sides of the House to mark 1,000 days since Putin's forces commenced their illegal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. On behalf of the Liberal Democrats, I want to pay tribute to the brave people of Ukraine. To those fighting on the front line in defence of the democratic ideals which we share, to those fighting the nightly terror of Russian missiles and drones which continue their assault on innocent civilians, to all Ukrainians who've sought safety here in the UK. And I'm also hugely proud of British families who open their doors to Ukrainians in their moment of need. Just a few days ago, I visited the charity Surrey Sons with Ukraine in my constituency in Epsom and met with volunteers who are preparing winter survival kits which will be sent to help Ukrainian families who face a winter with limited power supplies at best. The work of communities like these up and down the country is inspirational. We've stood with Ukraine from the beginning and we stand with Ukraine now. And I'm afraid to say that 1,000 days on, Ukraine needs our support more than ever. Liberal Democrats welcome the US's decision on long-range missiles, and I hope the Foreign Secretary might be able to shed a little more light on the UK's stance. But we must go further. The clock is ticking. January the 20th will be the second inauguration of President Trump. So does the Foreign Secretary agree with me, with a wavering US, it is incumbent on the UK to lead within Europe now? Will the Foreign Secretary commit to bolstering support for our Ukrainian allies should it waver elsewhere? And will the government begin the process of seizing the Russian assets, the assets themselves, not just the interest, so that we can give Ukraine what is needed to liberate its territory and win the war? Let's lead the way. Let's liberate Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Liberal Democrats for their continued support, and the Honourable Lady was right to evoke the huge volunteer spirit also across our country. I think of the thousands of people driving trucks to Ukraine, the faith groups, NGOs and others gathering heaters and goods and ensuring that they get to Ukraine, doing it month after month. They don't need encouragement. They just know, and sometimes it's off the news, but they know how important that endeavour is as well. And let me just say to her, this morning I was speaking to foreign ministers in a meeting from France, from Germany, from Poland, from Italy, from Spain. There is no sense of us wavering, there's no sense of us wavering in our support for Ukraine. If anything, there was a commitment to double down on that support. There was a determination to ensure that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position in 2025, and a renewed effort to ensure that we coordinate even better over the coming months particularly.
Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tamajit Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. On this grim milestone of 1,000 days since the full-scale invasion by Russia, we mourn the deaths of the hundreds of thousands who have needlessly been killed and injured because of Putin's decision to invade a democratic nation. I met recently with the Ukrainian ambassador, General Zaluzny, and also separately with a delegation of Ukrainian MPs who are very, very grateful for our solidarity, but they also have some concerns. The government has rightly provided strong support to our allies, but after the escalatory deployment of North Korean troops on European soil and the constant bombardment of Ukrainian communities by Putin, what conversations has my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, had with the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence about lifting restrictions of the long-range Storm Shadow missiles for their usage by Ukraine?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is my first opportunity to congratulate my good friend on becoming chair of the Defence Select Committee. He asks a question that's in the news at this time, and obviously we continue to discuss with Ukraine and international partners how best to support them going into winter. But I know he will understand that I have nothing new to say on this, because I'm not going to get into operational decisions that would be a gift, frankly, to Putin. We've gifted military aid to support Ukraine's right to self-defense against Russia's illegal attacks in accordance, as he would expect, with international humanitarian law.
Previous Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is 1,000 days when Ukraine has been fighting for Europe's freedom, but it is over 3,900 days that Ukraine has been under attack and under invasion. 3,900 days of bravery, of terror and of loss. I would like to pay tribute to the Honourable Lady on the Shadow Front Bench for all she did to create the Homes for Ukraine programme when many thought it an impossible thing to do. Consistently, though, Ukraine has been underestimated and Russia overestimated, militarily, economically and beyond. We all know here that personalities matter, and as the Foreign Secretary said, we know that Trump likes winners. The US government, the new US government's leader, Trump, needs to see success and victory for Ukraine as a personal victory for him. So what is the Foreign Secretary doing to make sure that Trump sees it in those terms and no other?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her work previously on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and we were able to work together quite well when I was in my shadow opposition role. She's right to say we've actually got a job to do now. One American president at a time is the mantra. We've got another 8 weeks, and Ukraine is going into a winter. And it may well be a bitter winter. And the good news is that we are now getting the money out the door. Where there's been gaps between pledging and getting the kit and the equipment into Ukraine, there's a doubling down across Europe in the international G7 partners to ensure that the kit gets there, and that puts Ukraine in a strong position into 2025. I am confident that on January the 20th, Ukraine will be in an even stronger position then than it is today because of that combined allied effort, and absolutely with the United Kingdom because of the work of the Defence Secretary, the Prime Minister and myself to ensure that we are its strongest partner and that we are doing everything we can to support it militarily, economically and humanitarianly.
Clive Betts.
Madam Deputy Speaker, could I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, and indeed thank him and our right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, for the joint leadership they have shown on this matter. The key issue, as far as I can see, is the shipment of oil. Oil is the lifeblood for Putin, and financing his illegal activities, and sanctions are the way that we've got to stop that. Could my right honourable friend therefore give an assurance that there are now no British individuals or companies engaged in the illegal shipment of oil or its financing? And if he can't give that assurance today, what further action is he going to take so he can come to the House in the relatively near future and give such an assurance?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his question, and it allows me to say that sanctions have deprived Russia of over $400 billion since February 2022, and that's equivalent to 4 more years of funding for the invasion. But he is also right that there is a shadow fleet. Over the last few months, I have issued more sanctions on those behind that shadow fleet. And he's right also to single in on the enablers, and the enablers that might exist within our own country. Trust me, I keep this under close scrutiny. There is more to come, I suspect, over the coming days. He's absolutely right to make it crystal clear that we cannot have UK businesses, enterprising individuals supporting supporting Russia in their war effort.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to welcome the statement from the Foreign Secretary, but I would like to push him on the issue that was highlighted by the Chairman of the Defence Select Committee. Britain has continuously led the way, right from the start, whether it's the provision of Javelin, whether it's the provision of main battle tanks, whether it's been leading the arguments about fast jets. And reading the newspapers, I would have believed that the Foreign Secretary had been leading the way in pushing for Storm Shadow to be used in Russia. Now, the Foreign Secretary dismisses it and says, well, this isn't to be discussed. But when are we going to hear from the government that the Ukrainians are going to have the ability to use Storm Shadow on targets in Russia? Is it going to be next week, next month, next year? Because The Americans are shaming us. We shouldn't be shamed. We should be leading.
Secretary.
Well, look, I understand the strength of feeling that the right honourable gentleman is demonstrating in the House, and why, as a backbencher, he's doubling down on this issue. What I think he'll see from this government is actually we have led and continue to lead in those debates right across our allies. But he will also understand that we do need communication discipline on these issues. That is what we see with our opponents in Russia, in the DPRK, and in Iran. And therefore, I lament a little some of the debate that we read across the newspapers. You're not going to get those sorts of leaks or suggestions from me at the dispatch box.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you. As Chair of the Ukraine Group in Parliament, I'd first of all like to thank the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary for all their staunch work in support of Ukraine. We've seen a lot of talk about escalation. Last week, we had a group of Ukrainian MPs in Parliament talking about the continued and escalating attacks on the country, particularly on the city of Kharkiv, the city of 2 million people. Today, we've got a Moldovan group in talking about an attempt by Russia using dirty cash brought from suitcases from Moscow to buy their elections. We're seeing a hybrid war against the whole of Europe, including ourselves, the United Kingdom. The threats of escalation by the Kremlin are happening, irrespective of the action of the United Kingdom or any other country. North Korean troops are in Ukraine now, fighting on European soil. I want the Foreign Secretary to reassure me that whatever the threats from the Kremlin, our support will be unstinting, and we will not stand back from supporting Ukraine's right to self-determination.
Secretary.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for all that he is doing on the all-party group on Ukraine, and to champion their cause in this Parliament and beyond this place, for the visits that he's made and the updates that he's been able to give me over the last few years. He raises a number of issues, and I want to assure him that we are alongside him and we continue to be alongside the Ukrainian people. But he does raise one issue, Madam Deputy Speaker, which I think is important, that hasn't come up so far. And it's, of course, the malign activity of Russia and the hybrid threats that they're engaged in right across the region. And one country, particularly Moldova, is on the front line of Russian hybrid threats. And the interference in their elections has been entirely unacceptable. And we stand in solidarity with them, and we will continue to support them against the threats to journalists, the disinformation, and the other extreme examples that they're receiving at this time from the Russian regime.
Stephen Gethin.
Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement, and also the acknowledgement that this war has not just been going on for 1,000 days, but for over a decade, with Ukrainians fighting for our freedom as well as fighting for their own country's independence, and put on record my party's support for the action that we're taking so far. And I'd particularly like to put on support for the Ukrainians. But can he answer me a number of questions? On drones technology, we're seeing delays in releasing some of the licences. Can he speak to his colleagues in the Department for Business around that? Can we get some more in-country cooperation, given how far advanced the Ukrainians' technology is? On the Russian Federation being able to strike Ukraine with impunity, does he agree with me we can no longer allow that to continue? And finally, there are $300 billion worth of Russian assets that they have forfeited. Will he at least make a commitment to look into releasing those so we can fund Ukraine properly? Slava Ukraina.
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, that was a number of questions on the licence issue, which he does raise, and which I've also seen in the papers. Can I assure him we've looked at this thoroughly? There's no sense of holding anything up. We've got the most robust export licensing regime in the world. We stand by that export licensing regime. It was actually put in place by the last government, but there is no sense at all of it holding things up unnecessarily. He's right to raise the issue of technology, and actually that's precisely why, particularly in terms of drone technology, that we are able, and Ukraine is able, with precision, technology to target those Russian attacks particularly. And can I reassure him that we will continue to lead on the question of seized and Russian assets, and I intend to redouble my efforts with allies who are not as advanced as we are on this issue across the coming months.
Matt Order.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement. I'm delighted to hear more of the details that he outlined today. Could he provide a little more detail also on the discussions with our friends and allies across the West? And also, could he reassure residents within Britain about the part they can play? He spoke very eloquently about that, and indeed my own local Ukrainian community centre has played a very important role in our area.
Well, thank you. I thank my honourable friend for that question. I'd want to say to the British people that they should take heart that this Parliament is speaking with one voice, and they should take heart that actually, if we can get through 2025 and this country has done all it can to ensure that militarily and economically Ukraine can get through 2025, and we've pushed and nudged our allies to ensure that we're in that place, then things get a hell of a lot tougher for our Russian opponents. And therefore, I think in thinking about that winter, all that they have been doing to send equipment over to Ukraine where they can, to support Ukrainians in this country. It is tough for Ukrainians at this time in Ukraine. There are still people leaving the country for obvious reasons. All that effort is not in vain. It's hugely, hugely important, and I'm hugely, hugely grateful.
Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Despite the Foreign Secretary's congratulatory assessment, the fact remains that Russia is running rings around Western sanctions, and that it is using black and grey fleets to threaten the global maritime order. I've heard nothing from the Foreign Secretary about what he intends to do about that. Could he enlighten us?
Foreign Secretary.
I don't take issue that there are still gaps, there are still holes, and Putin has been very clever in attempting to get round those sanctions that I put in place. But on the 17th of October, we sanctioned a further 18 oil tankers in the Russian shadow fleet, bringing the total number to 43. And in the margins of the EPC summit in Berlin, we led the call to action on tackling the shadow fleet, which has now been endorsed by 46 countries in the European Union. So the suggestion that we're doing nothing does not hold. And on circumvention, of course, we'll continue to address circumvention, and this includes highlighting the circumvention risks to partners such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkey, the United Emirates, and supporting their efforts to continue to tackle this problem.
Madam Speaker, can I welcome the statement from the Foreign Secretary, and will he join me in paying tribute to the Huddersfield Ukrainian Club, who continue to support families who have had to flee Ukraine, including many children? It's really important, probably more now than ever, that we work closely with European allies. So can he set out how he will strengthen that cooperation? And as Ukraine faces a very long and challenging winter, how will we help Ukraine cope with the relentless attacks on its energy infrastructure?
Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for that question. And as I was outlining this morning, I spoke to the Weimar Group of nations across Europe. It's not a forum traditionally that the UK participates in, but I was very grateful to the Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski for reaching out at this time and ensuring that I, the Italian, Spanish, were part of that grouping that's normally with France and with Germany. And it's an indication of how united we are attempting to be at this time. She rightly raises the big issues around energy and energy over this next period. And in a sense, it calls into mind these pernicious attacks over the last 48 hours from Russia, driving at those energy supplies, trying basically to turn the lights out in Ukraine. and we must do all we can in coordinated efforts to repel that activity and to help Ukraine repel that activity over the coming months.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And my question for the Foreign Secretary is about security guarantees. As we mark 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion, we should remember that Ukraine's allies failed to deter Russia in advance of the invasion. I do understand why a country at war cannot be admitted to NATO, but we must not ever again offer some meaningless paper pledge that was the Budapest Memorandum. Here. What is the government's latest thinking in relation to a meaningful security guarantee by Ukraine's allies from the point when the fighting stops?
Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman asks a good question, and it's easy to look back with hindsight. I personally was critical that the UK did not play a part in the Minsk agreement. I think we were absent, and we could have played a far greater role. Our belief is that Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, and allies agreed at Washington that there is to be an irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership, and that is the right thing. In the meantime, the UK and our allies are stepping up support for Ukraine's immediate and long-term self-defence. And of course, he's right. We must ensure, and this war will end one day, we must ensure that it cannot continue again or start again, and that will mean very serious security guarantees for Ukraine.
Sam Colling.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I thank the Foreign Secretary and members across the House for the very strong cross-party support for Ukraine that has been shown over recent years and no doubt will continue to be shown. On Saturday, I had the privilege of attending an annual art exhibition run by an organisation called Helping Our Ukrainian Friends in northwest Cambridgeshire. And it's a small organisation from a number of rural villages, but they've been able to raise over £300,000 in financial support for Ukraine, as well as over 100 tonnes of humanitarian aid, which they've delivered over the course of 20 trips. Will the Foreign Secretary join me in congratulating this group and thanking people across our country who've made personal efforts to support Ukraine?
Secretary.
Well, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to reply to the Honourable Gentleman, because I was once the baby of the House, much thinner, much better looking, but I remember sitting in his place 25 years ago, and he's absolutely right. The volunteer spirit across this country, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been extraordinary. People making so many missions to Ukraine, facing danger, going into Poland to support on the borders. It's quite incredible, and of course, I congratulate all those in his constituency for the work that they have done.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement, but I can't hide my disappointment that he's got nothing to say about freeing the hands of the Ukrainians to use our long-range missiles. How can he lament the attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure when he won't allow the Ukrainians to use our weapons to strike back and retaliate? He says all the time, we're doing all we can, but we're not. We're now foot dragging. We used to lead, now the Americans are in the lead. Can I invite him to change the paradigm of this war and lead from the front by setting an example, as my right honourable friend, the former Defence Secretary, described, as we did in the past? Otherwise, he's foot dragging, not leading.
Foreign Secretary.
I'm not foot dragging, Secretary, by the right honourable gentleman. We are leading, but we must be careful not to discuss in details these plans across this House. We mustn't abuse, and I say this very gently, we mustn't abuse the fact that this is a democratic chamber that Putin and others pore over. Trust me, we are leading in that debate. We want to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. I was discussing this with the Ukrainian Foreign Minister just yesterday in New York. I will meet with the Ukrainian ambassador after this. We will ensure that they are in the strongest possible position.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his personal and relentless leadership on sanctions against those aiding and abetting Russia's illegal invasion. I'm sure my right honourable friend will agree it's vital they're well enforced. So can I ask him whether in his review he would also include the credible allegations of sanctions evasion via Hong Kong, and closer to home, if he could do his utmost to end the continued delay to the release of the £2.5 billion from the sale of Chelsea Football Club that remains untapped at a time when the humanitarian need is so high.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for that question and for his continued work. We are committed to strengthening sanctions enforcement through the October launch of the new Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation. We've introduced new civil monetary penalties for certain trade sanctions breaches and the ability to make details of breaches public too. Yes, we will look at the situation in relation to those entities in Hong Kong. I saw that he raised the issue of Chelsea Football Club in questions to the Defence Secretary just a few weeks ago, and again I can confirm that that remains very definitely in view.
Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement. In the statement, he said that we would provide £3 billion a year in military aid this year, next year and every year it is needed. And that is very much welcomed, I'm sure, not least in Ukraine. But I would have thought what they would equally welcome is the fact that 8 weeks from today, there will be a new administration in Washington. They need assistance now, because Putin will probably not pay a price in 8 weeks' time, because all of the soundings that has come out from Washington. They need help now to hit back at Putin now.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman, the point he's made is precisely the point I made to European allies this morning. I didn't have a Northern Ireland accent, but believe me, I made the point as forcefully as he's just done.
Steve Race.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to put on record my thanks to the hundreds of Exeter and Devon families who have played host to over 500 Ukrainian families over the past 1,000 days, and also to those Ukrainian families for bringing such life and vitality to the city and sharing their culture with us so readily. Can I ask the Secretary of State what the government is doing to strengthen European cooperation in support of Ukraine as it heads into this very bitter winter?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. It was very important for me to be at the Foreign Affairs Council for Europe in Luxembourg. It was important for me to go back. The meeting I was in this morning was also important, and the first time for a UK Foreign Secretary. We're serious about that reset with the European Union and our European partners. This is a time for more multilateralism, not less.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I refer you to my register of interests. I host a Ukrainian refugee in my home, alongside many other residents of Mid Dorset and North Poole, and I want to publicly thank them for opening up their homes and for the contribution made by those families that are joining them. They were telling me this weekend, over a cup of tea, that they're really afraid that they are never going to be able to go back home. And they are terrified for their parents and grandparents who are stuck in a living hell in Kherson. They do not think they will ever leave, and they think they will be forever living under occupation. What assurance can the Foreign Secretary give to those people who are living here that we will extend their visas for as long as they're needed, and that if necessary we will allow their families to travel to join them?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, thank you to the Honourable Lady for all that she is doing and for championing these issues. The United Kingdom is preparing to sign a 100-year partnership with Ukraine. That is the nature and the depth of the relationship we are setting out with the Ukrainians over the years to come. And that partnership, that support, that standing with them will survive all parliamentarians, even the baby of the House currently in this chamber today. And that is the reassurance. This is a great country. It's a great privilege to stand at this dispatch box as Foreign Secretary. You wear that aware that others have stood here and stood up to tyranny. We will continue to do that, and you must reassure them that they will prevail.
Final question, Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the statement from the Foreign Secretary. I'm sure the House will agree with me that 1,000 days of a full-scale war are 1,000 days too many, and my condolences and thoughts are with all the innocent civilians on both sides tragically killed or affected by the conflict and who did not ask for war. Notwithstanding Ukraine's right to full self-defence, can the Foreign Secretary confirm to the House that the UK military aid provided to date has not and will not be used against civilians or civilian infrastructure? And will he assure the House that any decision on permitting the use of Storm Shadow missiles will ensure the safety of civilians and be in compliance with international law?
Well, this is the second or third occasion on which I've been able to answer the question from the Honourable Gentleman, and he has a humility and a gentleness in his manner that I'm sure will serve him well in this House. Can I reassure him that all that we do in this country is always in compliance with international humanitarian law? The modern architects of this country on both sides of the House gave us the rules-based system. We are one of the champions of it across the world, and so we will always behave in accordance with international humanitarian law.
So that concludes the statements. Colleagues leave the chamber quietly and quickly. I now come to the 10-minute rule motion. I call Daniel Francis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to introduce a bill to make provision for the accessibility of air travel for disabled passengers. I'm seeking to introduce legislation to create stricter regulations for airports and airlines to ensure they can facilitate the smooth journey of disabled passengers to enter the airport, navigate security, board the aircraft and have a safe journey before disembarking at their destination. The bill also aims to grant the Civil Aviation Authority, the CAA, greater powers to fine airports and airlines for not complying with regulations to accommodate disabled passengers, to provide adequate compensation to them and to promote further accessibility in future development in the aviation industry. Accessibility in air travel is not just a matter of convenience, it's a matter of rights, dignity and equality. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their mobility or physical condition, can enjoy the freedom to travel, whether for work, family or leisure, without facing undue barriers or discrimination. I'd like to pay tribute to Baroness Tanni-Grave-Thompson and thank her for spending time last week to discuss her direct experience of these issues with me. I'd also like to pay tribute to my friend the Secretary of State for Transport for her announcement this month setting up the Aviation Accessibility Task and Finish Group. The group, to be chaired by Baroness Grey-Thompson, will report back next summer and is dedicated to examining the current legislation and providing a report examining how to break down barriers, making air travel better and more accessible for disabled passengers. My bill aims to assist with implementing any recommendations, but also to address issues which are already known relating to fines and compensation. I'd like to place on record my thanks to Sophie Morgan, Christopher Wood and their colleagues at the Rights on Flights campaign for their work to raise awareness of these issues. Their group has campaigned admirably since its creation in 2023 on accessibility in air travel. My bill takes into account their work in designing a proposed Assisted Air Travel Act, recommending extending the accessibility and rights of air travel for disabled people. I'm grateful for their continued support in the creation of my 10-minute rule bill. All too often, we all hear stories and see videos of wheelchair users being forced to crawl through or off an airplane due to a lack of equipment, knowledge and space on board. I'm grateful to Frank Gardner, who, like Sophie Morgan and Baroness Grey-Thompson, has highlighted these issues and their own experiences. And these experiences are sadly also shared by blind and sight-impaired passengers. Research conducted last year by Which showed that the most inaccessible or challenging acts of air travel are navigating the airport, arranging assistance to board and disembark the plane, and getting to and from the airport. The issues of accessibility can occur at check-in desks and security, along with a lack of clear signage and inefficient procedures. Once passengers have boarded the plane, the issues begin to manifest tenfold for disabled passengers. The current design of many aircraft does not meet the needs of disabled passengers. There is often inadequate space for wheelchair users to navigate the cabin, and the facilities available on board, such as accessible bathrooms, are limited or non-existent on many flights. However, while airlines may offer assistance to board and disembark, the quality and availability of this assistance can vary drastically from one airline to another, and there is little, if any, regulation. Making airports legally liable for the bad treatment and discriminatory practices against disabled passengers would give consumers the ability to sue airlines for disability discrimination. Many air carriers do not provide the space or the safety requirements for a passenger to fly in their own wheelchair. And to facilitate this, wheelchair blocks should be included to allow wheelchair users to safely remain in their chairs throughout the flight. Many of these changes will be an ongoing development in new aircraft and should also feature wider aisles, larger accessible bathrooms and priority seating for those requiring special assistance. I accept a number of leaders in the field are working to design a new range of airlines that will redesign aircraft to make this part of the journey experience easier. For those that are able to get on a plane in the first place, they're often left with the worry of their wheelchair being damaged in transit or from a lack of knowledge by airport staff. It's therefore paramount that a single set of rules and regulations are applied to all airlines to promote better knowledge among airport and airline staff to minimise the risk of damages to wheelchair and mobility scooters. Once a passenger has reached their destination, their need to quickly access and use their mobility equipment is paramount and is further hindered by any damage sustained. There must therefore be measures in place to ensure that air carriers and airport managing bodies have the means available to securely transfer and stow mobility aids and avoid all forms of hand carrying of power wheelchairs and other large mobility aids to minimise the risk of damage and the risk of injury to staff. This also requires the need for further training for airport and airline staff on how to assist disabled travellers from the airport to on board the plane. Training must also be provided to staff on how to manoeuvre disabled passengers and their mobility equipment in an emergency. There needs to be more consistency in the accessibility services provided by airlines and airports. Too often, the quality of service can vary from one airport or airline to another, and this inconsistency leads to confusion and delays for passengers. We need clearer, standardised protocols that can be relied upon by all. The CAA is responsible for the regulation of aviation safety in the UK, but as it currently stands, the CAA is inhibited without the power to fine airlines. Instead, they must rely on taking businesses to court to force them to uphold passenger rights. It's therefore imperative that a suitable compensation and penalty charge scheme is introduced with new legal rights for complaint handling, reporting and enforcement procedures. This would include plans for the CAA to be able to issue financial penalties to airlines that fail in their obligations to disabled travellers. It would ensure the CAA has legal powers to fine airlines and other actors in the air travel sector if they fail to look after disabled passengers and their mobility devices, whether the harm is due to damage or neglect. This would help create an equal basis in air travel for disabled people. Airlines and airports typically have their own claims procedure to follow, leading to a lack of cohesion and often more confusion and difficulty for consumers to navigate the process. The combined outcome can lead many consumers to not claim for their owed compensation. In November 2024, the CAA's independent panel recommended new consumer enforcement powers and reformed alternative dispute resolution schemes. Without the needed enforcement powers, consumers face lengthy waits to receive assistance and are often misinformed about their rights, and the CAA do not have the powers to investigate concerns. Currently, the amount of compensation available through these complex rules may be limited to around £1,300, while many wheelchairs could be worth 6 or 7 times this amount. The issue is exacerbated by the fact that while airports should be responsible for providing a temporary alternative while the wheelchair or mobility aid is repaired or replaced, this does not have to be on a like-for-like basis. As the parent of a wheelchair user, I fully appreciate the issues outlined by campaigners, and like others, my family have taken a decision for many years that flying would simply be too much hassle, and the distress of a damaged or lost wheelchair at the end of a flight is too upsetting to consider. Every person should have the right to use an airplane for leisure, family or work purposes. However, the current facilities of airports and airlines and the lack of powers of the CAA is prohibiting disabled passengers from accessing aviation travel. My bill would be applicable to all carriers, domestic and foreign, undertaking flights within, from and to the airspace of the UK, as well as all airports within the UK. The bill's provisions would extend to tour operators, ground handlers, service providers and all stakeholders, along with their subcontractors involved in providing goods and services to disabled people, travelling within or through the United Kingdom. In conclusion, the Aviation Accessibility Bill would make the necessary changes to the law to ensure airports and airlines are better able to provide facilities for disabled passengers.